It's just because that I have left. Yeah. So I can make that work. No, unless you want to.
Could you do a little tap?
Oh, yeah. Right here?
Yeah.
So you say they want to meet or you're not sure? Yeah.
I think it was.
Gosh.
We can plan on Zooming. See you next Friday. Yeah. No, actually, it's not.
Screen on so you can look at yourself.
Oh, thank you. That's good. Hi. Just looking for those.
So send it to the first and maybe we can also meet on the 21st. I think that it's available. I usually have all the notifications turned off.
Ooh, that's good. I like that.
I feel like this one's always the tricky one because you don't get.
Do not disturb. Hey, Muriel. Oh wait, is there pizza? I need calories.
I'll get you pizza. Here. Why don't you have a seat and then I promise Joaquin a tour later when he's feeling it. I'll get you some pizza. Okay?
Oh no, it's okay. Just like, yeah. Okay.
It's also
You're the best.
You're the best.
Thanks.
Okay. Oh. Poop. Yeah. Muriel is getting me some emergency calories in the form of pizza. So, oh, you're amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So my plan was to go to 21 and then I thought today was I always think my classes. I don't really know. I have no. And I think Saturday is more like. But that's what folks there. I don't know if they actually happen. Then I turned my living room into off. Yeah. So I've started to plan.
Oh my gosh. Hi.
I'm Nick.
I'm Vanessa. Nice to meet you.
Your work, can I just say? I would like read a page and be like,
Thank you so much. I have
no,
a
you're fine.
mouthful of
Eat,
pizza.
please eat.
This is my first meal of the day.
I know. I just had a glass of wine and a little food. But
See, there you go.
you know, trying. You know, Brown got to survive, baby.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, but a lot of I was like, fuck. So I'm working on a piece about lullabies, and the way you reframe that.
Oh, with the
The
Cri
bra-
Cri
yeah,
song? Yeah.
I was like, because the way I'm writing, people are like, wait, lullaby, Nick, what are you talking about? And I'm like, no, a brown lullaby. No.
Yeah, they're different. Yeah.
Reclaiming, returning. Sorry,
Yeah.
I'll let you eat.
Yeah. No, but thank you.
Oh, no, I'll talk. I'm going to
Yeah.
praise you.
Thank you so
Brown
much.
to brown. Oh, I got you.
Thank you.
I got
Thank you so much.
I love Vanessa. That's like I'm like, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just having some pizza in the corner.
Pizza in the corner.
Pizza in the corner. Am I making too much noise?
No.
Should I turn it off?
No,
Okay.
you're fine.
Okay. Because I'm chewing, and now I'm like, oh no. Can they hear the chewing?
Wait, Vanessa, you missed it.
Is this good?
No, I can
That's okay.
Okay.
she's like really like, you know.
Okay. Hello, hello. Hi, beautifuls. Look at you all. I'm happy to see you all on a Thursday night. Welcome. Thanks. Yeah, welcome once again. How's everybody doing? Everybody's okay? Hey. I'm loving this energy. Okay. Well, again, welcome. Anthony says hello. He's not able to join us, but hopefully he's watching right now. If you don't know me already, I'm Caribbean, Fragosa. I'm writing faculty here. Let's see. And before I introduce our guest, Vanessa Angelica Villarreal, I want to make a few very quick announcements. So we have a lot of upcoming events. Of course, we have AWP coming up. Everybody here is going. I'm going to see you all there. Stay tuned for some emails that Anthony or someone will be sending out with updates on who's doing what. There's so much going on for AWP, so just keep your eye out for those emails. We also have a symposium with Chris Santiago and Wendy Ortiz on documentary strategies. That's coming up April 10th, so I believe that's right after spring break. Who's looking forward to spring break? Anybody? Okay, just wondering. And then early May 1st, we have Jess Arndt and Amina Kane having a night of fiction. So that's something to look forward to. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our very special guest, Vanessa Angelica Villarreal. Is a poet, essayist, single parent, and first-generation Mexican immigrant born in the Rio Grande Valley and raised in Houston, Texas. Do we have any Tejanas in the house? No tech? No? All right. Only got brown people. Formerly labeled an at-risk youth and expelled from the Texas public school system, she is the first in her family to graduate high school and the first to attend college and the first to graduate with an advanced degree. She earned her MFA from the University of Colorado at Boulder and a doctorate in English literature and creative writing at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. Her areas of study are decolonial and critical race theory, memory studies, Black and Indigenous ecologies, affect theory, queer phenomenology, popular culture and media studies, speculative nonfiction, critical fabulation, visual and documentary poetics, and transnational, transborder feminism.
Okay.
Yes. I'm reading it because she is the author of the essay collection Magical Realism, Essays on Music, Memory, Fantasy, and Borders, published by Tiny Reparations Books 2024, long listed for the National Book Award and National Book Critics Circle Award. And the poetry collection Beast Meridian, published by Noemi Press in 2017, is the recipient of a 2019 Whiting Award and a Kate Tufts Discovery Award nomination. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Magazines, The Cut, Harper's Bazaar, Oxford American, Paris Review, Poetry Magazine, and elsewhere. She is also the recipient of a 2021 National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship. I first knew about Vanessa Angelica Villarreal from a very short list by Rigoberto Gonzalez, where he lists his favorite books, published in the LA Times in 2017. I don't know if you remember. It was a very short list. It consisted of only 2 authors. He only had 2 favorite books. One of them was Vanessa Angelica Villarreal. And indeed, Vanessa was a revelation to many of us who learned of her and her work through Beast Meridian that earned enviable reviews from authors such as Khadijah Queen, who calls Beast Meridian a fierce incantation, harnessing the intuition and intelligence of personae, navigating a melancholy galaxy. Get ready. Vanessa has since become a shining star among our constellation of writers here in Los Angeles.
That's right. Let it be known.
Her newest book, Magical Realism, was called an energetic, paradigm-shifting book by another favorite author of mine, Carmen Maria Machado. I call her book a key to a time machine or a compass for portals to other times and other dimensions. At the height of the pandemic and quarantine, Vanessa's essays helped me find time portals of my own when the world felt unsafe and our daily lives became prisons. Her essays on Selena, fantasy and magical realism, published in 2020, 2022, and 2023 in Harper's Bazaar, helped me breathe my way back into the world through the rhizomatic pathways of the imagination. With a renewed and empowered speculative eye, I was able to find space and movement again because of her writings. And I also found creative fodder by dipping into the thick waters of my subconscious, now freshly fed by the trauma of the first Trump administration, as well as the horrors of the COVID pandemic. Today, her book makes the case that now more than ever, we need to re-energize our imaginations, not just the algorithms of AI, to envision and create a future in which we all survive and we are all safe. Please welcome Vanessa Angelica Villarreal.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. I'm humbled. Oh, yeah, that's right. Gracias. Hola, buenas noches. Hola. ¿Cómo están? ¿Cómo están? Hold up. I know how hooks work, I think. Okay. Thank you so much for making time in your day to attend this event. And thank you so much to Caribbean Fregosa. I'm actually speechless, which like never happens. And that, I mean, yeah, like I play a bard in D&D, right? Like words are my power. And that introduction rendered me speechless. So I thank you so much. Thank you so much for seeing me. It's an honor to be here with you all. My kiddo might be wandering around with Muriel, so they might come in. But today, I'm going to present an essay that I've been working on since at least 2019. I remember watching Game of Thrones and just like taking in all the podcasts, and it just felt like this really big cultural moment, but it was a cultural moment that was for a very specific group of people. And I remember just kind of joking around that Jon Snow was a fronterizo or a borderlands figure. And once I like read the books and I really started thinking about it, I was like, wait, why didn't anybody have that reading? There are feminist readings of this show, right? Like what? There's a wall at the center of this show. So the essay, the last essay, the one that I worked the longest on and that shaped this book is called When We All Loved a Show About a Wall. Imagine just for a moment that the biggest, most watched television show in the world is set on a border. And imagine its hero is named after the land, but unable to claim any of it. His name is just Snow, a white field where an ancestry should be. He is a bastard, son of a nobleman and a mystery woman, and therefore a second-class citizen who cannot take his father's name. Entitled to nothing, his lineage erased, barred from social mobility. So with no one and nowhere to go, he has no choice but conscription to a life patrolling the border, marked by a wall. He's been brought up to believe that borders are just, that the wall is protective, and that the Border Patrol are a brotherhood of honorable men. But in his duty, he finds that his fellow officers are corrupt sadists, rapists, and murderers, and the people on the other side are not the enemy, but dispossessed indigenous refugees. wildlings, descendants of the first men who, after centuries of separation and violence, now live in extreme poverty and danger. He has been brought up to hate his kin, made other by the political veil a wall becomes. The refugees are fleeing a global threat the whole realm denies. The memory of racial extinction at the hands of men, embodied in the form of an undead king who brings climate change, with dead wildlings as his army, marching steadily toward the living. Our hero captures a wildling girl who challenges his unquestioning loyalty to the Border Patrol, to a country that denies them both the right to a life, his most fundamental beliefs. He falls in love, and upon living with the wildlings, undergoes a profound crisis of identity. The wildlings' fight against extinction is justified and will be all of humanity's fight soon. When he returns to the Border Patrol, he is changed, his allegiances split. The living wildlings must cross the wall, or no one will survive. When he is promoted to commander of the Border Patrol, he uses his power to grant the wildling refugees safe passage across the border, an asylum, giving them back what land he can. But this is a grave betrayal of the Brotherhood, so a group of officers conspire to murder him. When he is brought back to life, he renounces Border Patrol and allies with the migrants, the indigenous, the refugees, in the fight to reclaim their ancestral lands as they too help him claim his. Soon, the wall will not be able to hold back the winter or the dead. The North remembers. Our hero, a bastard whose lineage is lost to the amnesia of history, fights for collective memory, and he cannot fight the darkness alone. Now imagine that this, the biggest, most watched television show of all time, airing this storyline at the height of family separations at the border, intended to make this statement. Fuck borders. Fuck Border Patrol. Fuck militarized walls and apartheid states and empire. Grant every indigenous refugee asylum and give them their land back as reparations. The memory of colonial violence will return to us in the form of climate change, mass displacement, and forced labor. Memory is the site of our collective survival. The land remembers. To remember is to refuse total annihilation. That show existed. It was called Game of Thrones, and that hero was Jon Snow. So why did critics collectively miss or avoid that reading?
All right.
In order to examine the cultural forces that created the conditions for the global phenomenon that was Game of Thrones, it's important to situate it as a show that spanned the 2010s, with the characters and plot lines that resonated rather than commented on the transition from Obama's 2 terms to Trumpism, neoliberalism to neo-fascism, mass shootings, Brexit, the alt-right white nationalist movement, Black Lives Matter uprisings, climate change, ICE, and the construction of the wall at the US-Mexico border. A major player in the era of prestige television, Game of Thrones' rich, complicated story became a global phenomenon with a universal appeal in a time when the monoculture was beginning to splinter into streaming niches. Perhaps the last truly universally loved show to air on television, its audiences spanned the political spectrum and defied age, race, gender, class, and borders. Endless cultural criticism and think pieces flooded the cultural landscape, scrutinizing Game of Thrones from every angle. And while there were occasionally some thoughtful takes by white feminists and academics unpacking the show's politics, the border wall remained largely unaddressed. Amid Obama's detention centers and anti-immigrant policies and Trump's family separations and incarceration of child migrants as our own wall went up. In the 9 years between 2011 and 2019, when Game of Thrones aired, not one major outlet published a meaningful reading by a Latina critic on the world's biggest show with a border wall at its center. This is a meaningful absence in the ongoing global conversation that was Game of Thrones, an American show produced by HBO in California, home to the largest migrant labor workforce in the United States. The whiteness of the American media landscape lacks the critical range to read the wall beyond its role as a set piece or plot device, or the subtexts of migration, climate change, neocolonialism, and race, which went largely uncritiqued for a decade. While white women could publish feminist critiques of the show's sexual violence and nudity or close readings of Daenerys and Cersei, no one ever thought to tap a Latina critic to write about their readings on the wall, on Jon Snow, on the racialization of Dorne. Even after the Trump White House released the Wall is Coming memes in GOT font in 2018, Latina critics were noticeably absent from the conversation, which more often than not leaned apolitical. Unlike Breaking Bad, Weeds, or Narcos, shows set on the literal US-Mexico border, Game of Thrones is set in a historical Western imaginary, free from the baggage of race and colonialism. Instead of racial stereotypes, its heroes and villains resonate with our own identities through the metaphors of monarchs, monsters, and magic. Perhaps its explosive popularity lay in its ability to mirror our subjectivities: racialization, gender, class, enslavement, indigeneity, migration, fugitivity, disability, monstrosity, within the brutal framework of white supremacy. Jon Snow is accidentally the best Mexican-American character ever written for television.
Come on now. All right, Vanessa.
I know, an absurd claim that at first I made only half jokingly. But as the seasons went on, I found deeper resonances with his character. Like every mestizo, he is a bastard, half noble, half erasure, unable to claim either lineage. Bastards are named after the land they're born on: sand, rivers, snow. As Jon Snow, he remains illegitimate and unclaimed by the Starks, and this nameless no identity defines him. Despite growing up in privilege, he is a second-class citizen. His name, Snow, is erasure, amnesia. Having no house name means he has no place in history and therefore has no future. He will not be remembered. He belongs to the land. Audiences had no problem grasping the wall at the edge of the North as a metaphor for the border, but the analysis never went past the structure, and the critique was always surface level, with murky walls are bad politics. In ecological readings, the wall is a metaphor for glaciers, the ice structures that hold off climate change, represented by the Night King and his undead army no one believes is real at the edge of the world. But in almost every analysis, the North is the site of the West's apocalyptic anxieties: climate change, the endless dispute for power bringing about nuclear winter, immigrant invasions. But few were able to parse the real-world allegory of the wall happening in real time: how borders are sites where climate collapse, mass migration and displacement, and the mobilization against empire become one and the same struggle. And who better to navigate this territory than a nameless, landless bastard conscripted to defend stolen land, a dispossessed person defending nobles' right to possess, a second-class citizen defending the ruling class, a border patrol whose identity crisis becomes a crisis of conscience. Like every traditional fantasy, Game of Thrones is a production of colonial, racial, and national imaginaries, where the story of the West, Eros, is centered, and all other histories are minimized and marginal by design. In this view of the world, Latina histories, geographies, and bodies are subaltern, illegible, rendered as stereotypes, like Oberyn Martell. Jon Snow was never imagined as Latine or mestizo, but as a tragic Arthurian hero and Aragorn with a trauma plot. His domain is the moral territory of power and war, a series of tests preparing him for his ascension to the throne. This is not the domain or the destiny of Latina characters. Latina characters are limited to colonial contexts: drug lords, revolutionaries, gangsters, maids, gardeners, parents, workers, lovers, struggling immigrants with a heart of gold and a supporting role. But Jon Snow patrols the physical and moral terrain of the border, and by depicting that structure with all the nuance and depth a heroic character requires, Game of Thrones accidentally portrayed the complexities and complicities of borderlands' mestizo identity. A Hollywood depiction of a son of immigrants becoming a border patrol might zoom in on his guilt, the suffering of migrants, appeal to audience empathy with unambiguous morals, the trap of representation. But the whiteness of Game of Thrones allowed us to see the wall stripped of its political stigmas and racialized contexts and see it for what it really is, a projection of narratives. In 2016, the Border Patrol Union opened its podcast called The Green Line by playing the oath taken by the Night's Watch in Game of Thrones. The end of the oath says, "I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the shield that guards the realms of men." In Border Patrol's interpretation, the realms of men they guard are ostensibly the United States and Canada, while the land beyond the wall, at least according to the lore, is the land of all that is not human, the others, the White Walkers, the dead. In our world, the wall separates humans from the violent animals of MS-13, according to President Trump, dehumanizing all migrants as other, monster, hordes of socially dead. In summer 2017, the final shot that concludes Game of Thrones season 7 finale is that of hundreds of thousands of undead whites walking through a breach in the wall, the colossal ice structure protecting the northernmost border of Westeros from a great evil in the wilds beyond. It is a terrifying, cataclysmic finale meant to fill the viewer with abject dread. And it does. The wall was the only thing standing between Westeros and the violent, mindless, ever-multiplying dead. Once the mindless hordes cross over, no army will be able to stop them. Everyone will die and rise again as one of the dead. On October 12, 2018, 1,000 Central American migrants were forced to leave San Pedro Sula, Honduras, and walk to the United States. Leaf rust, a fungal plant disease spreading rapidly in the warming temperatures, was on its 7th year of devastating the region's coffee crop. Small farms lay abandoned in the countryside, some to migration, others to violence, all to climate change. Indebted farmers were violently dispossessed or disappeared. Once predictable seasons lost their patterns. Without rain, there was no harvest, no work, nothing to eat. Displaced indigenous farmers became climate refugees, faced with a choice: migrate or starve. Men left their families, children left their parents, pregnant women left with children in tow. Over the next 2 months, the caravan swelled to more than 7,000, surviving Mexican state and cartel violence along the way. After walking more than 2,500 miles across the span of Mexico, from one ocean to another, they arrived in Tijuana in early December, along with the winter. In response to their arrival in Tijuana and their denial of asylum at the border, that following January, President Trump tweeted a graphic based on the Game of Thrones tagline, "Winter is coming," styled in the show's signature font. But instead, it said, "The wall is coming." Although Latinas are rarely, if ever, present in fantasy imaginaries, fantasy is inextricable from Latina immigrant lives, forming the language, symbols, technologies, and policies of far-right anti-immigrant actors. Peter Thiel, billionaire tech investor and Trump advisor, named his mass surveillance companies used by U.S. Customs and Border Protection and ICE after magical Lord of the Rings artifacts. Palantir, a data mining and visualization company, is named after the Palantiri, the 7 seeing stones, a network of crystal balls used to telepathically gather intelligence and surveil Middle Earth. Thiel's latest company, Anduril, is named after the sword reforged from the shards of Narsil. The sword Isildur used to cut Sauron down and wielded by Aragorn, king of Gondor and Isildur's heir. The runes inscribed on Anduril read, "Sun, I am Anduril, who was once Narsil, sword of Elendil. The slaves of Mordor shall flee from me." Moon. Anduril is the maker of a solar-powered surveillance tower that run day and night along the US-Mexico border. They are tall, thin steel poles with mounted cameras sticking up from the landscape like swords. This is Anduril on the cover. That's Anduril. And that's the wall. Yeah. The US-Mexico border wall itself is a fantasy. The fantasy of the white ethno-state and the fight against cultural and hemispheric rupture, surging with racialized, laboring bodies desperate to invade. Any border reinforced by a wall is a site of race-making, nation-building, resource hoarding, wealth extraction, and temporal dislocation. A narrative site where difference is produced through language and violently maintained by the fantasy of shared identity. For John, the violence required of him to maintain the wall rested on his identity as a man of Westeros, a fantasy of belonging that would only ever see him, a bastard and a man of the Night's Watch, as a second-class citizen, unworthy of title, land, or family name, and therefore any lineage or inheritance, futurelessness. The Night's Watch merely deputized him to maintain that fantasy with the invention of power over the wildlings, a power he wielded from the fantasy of belonging to a nation, an identity that under scrutiny falls apart once he realizes he has more in common with the dispossessed on the other side. And that delusion of belonging, despite marginalization and alienation, that striving to be from a lineage, a homeland, a tradition with ties you cannot claim and that will not claim you back. The name Snow that represents ancestral amnesia, the wall that maintains the fantasy and the complicity in its violence, and the slow process of disidentification with nation, borders, its wealthy families. That is a heroic Borderlands Latina story I have never seen on any screen. Game of Thrones is not a Latina Borderlands show, but its resonances are. I don't mean to give Benioff and Weiss undue credit. Rather, I intend to make legible an experience and perspective that are constantly rendered illegible in popular culture. How could a fantasy world like Westeros, so culturally and temporally removed from our post-colonial world, possibly be an allegory for the US-Mexico border or have Latin American migrants in mind? I'm not saying it did, but the answer, I think, lies in the collective unconscious and the images it renders in its geographies, its symbols, its others. George R. R. Martin might have based A Song of Ice and Fire on English history containing allegories of the War of the Roses and Hadrian's Wall. But he also lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and has since the 80s, mere miles from Diné territory. Just as Tolkien, an Oxford medievalist writing at the height of an immigrant surge from the West Indies, could not help but reproduce the post-colonial world and its races in Middle-earth, so too is Martin's imagination informed by the US-Mexico borderlands and its colonial constructs. He cannot help but reproduce its racial geographies. The North, like Santa Fe, is not just a borderlands, but a territory of overlapping histories. The Children of the Forest, the First Men, the Andals, the Starks, Westeros, the Wall, Yaqui, Diné, New Spain, Mexico, New Mexico, America, the border. Overlapping maps of a land caught between empire and indigenous memory. The US-Mexico border cannot be reproduced as realism in any story without also reproducing its affects or feelings, deeply held biases, racial constructions, fears, narratives, rhetorics. Fantasy decontextualizes its stigmas, detaches it from the anchors in our world so that only the symbols remain. This is why Trump and Border Patrol respond viscerally to the wall as a symbol of security and apartheid, a lure for a story that contradicts our assumptions. It is precisely because of the show's whiteness, its cast, characters, setting, and its allegorical framing in European history that such a radical geography could even be rendered on television, much less its political discourses. In Game of Thrones, fantasy allows the world a certain level of decontextualization where allegory distances as it compares. Game of Thrones whiteness empties the bodies at the border of their racial contexts, stripping the wildlings from any association to migrants from the global south as a faceless brown mass who are at best seeking a better life and at worst invading our country and breaking the law, in either way a source of cheap labor who will take advantage of social programs. Let's assume the representation of Latina people was the furthest thing from Martin's or Benioff's and Weiss's minds. As a piece of visual culture, Game of Thrones is a representation of Western power, rendered in the discursive and imaginative spaces of the fantastic. But it is also a product of the post-colonial imagination, reconceiving history through the filter of colonialism and race. So what can a fantastic rendering of the past tell us about power today? Since fantasy is a direct line to the realms of the symbolic and imaginary, it turns out it can tell us quite a lot. This is the power of fantasy. The ability to build worlds rendered historically neutral by whiteness, unburdened by the baggage of representation. Once the audience is transported to Westeros or any medieval Western imaginary, unbound from white guilt and the politics of representation, viewers' guards come down and are at ease and attention, receptive to the Trojan horse that is a beloved character's radical politics, subjectivities, identities. Jon Snow, for example, can denounce the Border Patrol by leaving the Night's Watch and grant all migrants asylum by giving the wildlings their land back. Someone just needs to interpret that reading afterward. It was extraordinary to watch a hero like Jon Snow and Daenerys, for that matter, perform the radical politics and subjectivities of slavery abolition and land back on the global stage and be beloved for it. But before I unpack these characters, I want to push back on white Western literary definitions of what fantasy is and what its possibilities can be. Before Tolkien, stories about heroes, monsters, magic, and myth were not fantasy, but part of a symbolic language that corresponded to the land and its culture, evolved out of every known oral tradition. Human consciousness evolved by encountering itself and the other in the realm of the symbolic, but Western literary tradition, especially fantasy, coded colonialism, race, and white supremacy into the genre, calling itself high fantasy and diminishing anything that wasn't set in medieval Europe as folklore, fable, anthropological artifact, or magical realism. It remains unlikely that a BIPOC fantasy show decentered from Europe and whiteness will have a Game of Thrones budget anytime soon. Until then, in the absence of our own narratives, we must find ourselves in the dominant culture, which necessitates that we read the material much more critically. But because existing critical frameworks, literary theory, anthropology, criticism are flawed, instead, I want to reconceptualize fantasy as the memory of the colonial unconscious, giving shape to the lost and suppressed symbols and images that persist in our cultural imaginaries. Imaginaries are powerful, primal repositories of images, symbols, and feelings that produce our reality and the imagined other every day and hold the power to invent nations, erase entire peoples, shape identities. For example, Claudia Rankine's concept of the racial imaginary is how the imagination structures the reality of race and animates the white fantasy of Black criminality to manifest as police violence. Racial imaginaries also have the power to construct national identities and its others. Fantasy traffics almost exclusively in the symbolic and the imaginary, providing accidental insight into the collective unconscious. Why are there still walls in our invented worlds? What do the trees remember? What do our monsters mean? Even in fantasy, the concepts of race, gender, class, nations, and borders are all reproduced. Westeros, Middle-earth, and other medieval fantasy worlds are created from colonial imaginaries that are not neutral, but instead a heightened projection of an unconscious desire and fear of the other. The same forces that create our politics, prejudices, and violences. Reproductions of race, white supremacist power dynamics, and gender violence are what can make fantasy seem like a reactionary genre, an escape to a world where white men can indulge fantasies of domination. But what if fantasy is not a genre of escape, but a site of deep imagining that plumbs the depths of our unconscious and reshapes us from the raw material of desire into more possible selves? For mestizas, people whose indigenous ties and lineages have been erased, a wall exists where relation should be. Fantasy can be a site of colonial memory, a glimpse of the world at the time of conquest, rendered in the memory of the West and its others, just beneath the surface in subtext. The weirwood trees, the dire wolves, the children of the forest. In the brief moments they appear on Game of Thrones, these images resonate like a memory without data, a feeling of recognition somewhere, mostly invented, that guides me toward memory recovery. The Wall and Jon Snow always meant more to me, a girl born between countries where the throat of the Rio Grande meets the sea, a girl for whom identity is an enigma of family secrets, colonial erasure, and disappearing memory. A girl born on the land of the nearly extinct Mexican gray wolf. A girl born stranded in a borderland, resigned to a foreclosed future. The Wall in Game of Thrones has the same function as the one in our world, a structure that divides peoples and invents separate territories, inscribed with spells to shield us from our own evil, patrolled by the very people it split. Jon Snow is so much more than an Arthurian hero, bastard, or king. He is a betrayed figure maligned as a traitor, an old story I've rarely seen in the mainstream. La Malinche, or the child of La Malinche, richly drawn and sad-eyed and complex, alive and on television. As a mestiza, the paths back to my ancestors have been obliterated from collective and institutional memory, and therefore time. If I say the words bracero, Zyklon B, or Operation Wetback, most people don't know that history. I barely exist in time, trapped in someone else's story. American history is a world-building project. Those who are not part of its past are not imagined in its future. So I have two choices: disappear or remember myself into existence. But how does someone with an obliterated history remember themselves back? Our most enduring narratives in popular culture are the most accessible texts available to working class immigrants to learn the lore of American history, learn its language and culture. Star Wars, Jurassic Park, Lord of the Rings, and my first, most accessible archive. But I am not imagined in these stories and therefore not remembered in American history. And those who are not remembered in history cannot be imagined in the future. By critiquing and contextualizing the stories everyone already knows, like Game of Thrones, and filling in their erasures, it's the best chance I have to write myself and everyone who came before me back into public memory, into the collective imagination. We connect to the characters we love based on our core wounds. Some of us will choose Daenerys if our core wound is centered around personal power, proving others wrong. Perhaps I should want to identify and defend Daenerys as a woman who has survived sexual violence, whose life has been determined by men in power, a woman who has had to fight for every inch of credibility in a world that devalues women. But I don't identify with Daenerys, a conqueror, daughter of a royal lineage, ambitious inheritor of a throne. I identify with Jon, a Borderlands figure, stranded in a white field, unsure of who he is. An unloved, outcast, misunderstood child who has only ever tried to be good, to keep his word, to fight for those he loves, to be claimed by the land he was born in. I identify with a man who will risk it all to tell the truth, to do what is right, however gray, even if it costs him everything. I see my grandmother's history in him, see her vindicated as he punches Ramsay Bolton over and over in the face, remembering my Tio Joel and the story of her rescue. I identify with a child whose past is a vast silence, who has only ever been lied to, who has lived absent of the people who loved him the most. I identify with a man who, in doing right, is exiled, banished, deported. In the closing scene of the series, he has been sentenced back to the wall, and upon his return, reunites with his wolf, Ghost, and the wildlings, who now claim him as their own. And as he passes through the wall on horseback to leave Westeros, he also exits the west, surrounded by his people, his black cloaked back to us, disappearing into the trees. That's it. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Vanessa has given us so much.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
I think I'd like to open it up for questions. I mean, I have lots of questions and things that I would love to say, but I really wanted to turn it over to you all.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Chicano. Mom's from Mexico, dad's from Nicaragua. Yeah. But I was thinking a lot about like how we don't see ourselves within these white-based stories, and I've actually been really wanting to like delve back into my family's history to unearth it, and there's like the word of like remembering just really stuck to me, and I'm just wondering for yourself, like, where do you start with your own remembrance?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for existing here in this institutional space. So one of the things that I ran into while I was writing this book and looking for, my grandmother's records, this all started because I went to Mexico to try to find out her story. Her story is very much like a silence in my family because she survived 2 extremely abusive marriages. She was married at 14 to a landowner, had my mom and my tío, and then she had to be rescued by her brother because she was basically kidnapped, and then from there it gets really fuzzy. We don't know if she changed her name. We don't know. We just know that she went to Tampico and started working in a doctor's office and met a doctor and lived like a very upper middle class life for a little while. My mom still insists that she's upper class. This is what Mexicans do. But she ended up having to escape him because he was even worse than the first. And yeah, she nearly died a couple of times, like with that man. And that is how she came to the United States. She came first, and then my mom and my uncle came after. And the thing is, when she left him, she lost her status. She lost everything. And because she left and came over undocumented, that is already like 3 layers of like erasure in the records, right? And so anytime I try to go look for her, I can't even find her name. And so I started asking my mom, what's her real name? What's your real name? And she was like, oh my God. And my dad would be like, yo digo que se llama Alma. Because that history, like my mom doesn't really remember. She came over as a child. And she was like a preteen. And like her, that's the nature of traumatic memory, right? And so where do you even start if like your own nation doesn't remember you? There are no records of you. So I went to go talk to my tía in Mexico, and this is where I found out that my grandmother was born on an hacienda to indigenous cotton laborers. And I say they're indigenous cotton laborers because they were in the Bracero program, and everything about that life when you live on an hacienda is in exchange for like living on that hacienda, you exchange your labor. And it was part of the encomienda system. Anyway, you didn't ask for all this. I'm just a yapper. I'm so sorry. But essentially, what I'm trying to say is that like, especially for colonized people, mestizos, right? Like the border itself is an eraser. the records in our countries are subject to so much corruption and like I had to like revisit like Catholic records to find like my indigenous family members. And so like they're just like all these barriers because we're just like not recorded in, you know, state archives or institutional memory. And so you have to start looking, you have to start comparing archives. So what I did was I started looking at border crossings. I found my great grandfather. He was a bracero and he registered like 86 hours of work at 64 years old on a farm, right? Like, and so like when those records are lost, when there is no path back to memory, when, you know, you ask your family members and you're just met with silence or like, you know, just like a wall, right? I personally just started like looking at the land. One of the ways that I found my grandmother was looking at like the rivers and how they used to empty into Torreon in a region called La Comarca Lagunera, which is essentially like where rivers empty into the land and, you know, made like a very fertile region. And so like you start looking at the plants of the region, you start looking at the haciendas that were there, you start looking at the railroads, right? And you start finding the names. So the land itself is a source of memory. There are many different kinds of archives that can start to help you piece your story together. Anyway, I will stop talking. I hope I answered your question. But yeah, so we didn't even touch on like fantasy and how we don't show up there, but you know, we'll talk later.
I can bridge that.
Yeah.
We'll jump over to Anna.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Similarly, yeah, I mean, I guess within your amazing essay collection, process around, I guess, like adapting some of that looking or some of that remembering into just like, I'd love to see some of the shapes of like what seedling began the book and then like how that developed and what the journey was like for collecting it all, I guess, because there's so many amazing, you know, interwoven threads and media aspects and, you know, personal history. And I know for a lot of us working with, like with nonfiction, creative nonfiction, it can feel so overwhelming sometimes.
Yeah.
To, you know, to make that into something obviously never linear, but you know, that there's pages you turn.
Yeah. in our lore, pages you turn and yeah, so this book was very much a product of like a few major forces that convened in my life. One was starting my PhD, and I started it when my kid was 1. And so I was taking on like all of this stuff, right, as a new mom. And, you know, I was also taking on like the majority of the domestic labor, and my marriage was very strained. Anyway, I ended up getting like a travel like award to go visit my tia so that I could ask her about my grandmother. And when I came back, my marriage fell apart. I lost my house. I had to move out. I became a single parent just like overnight on the day that my first book was published. Yeah, and Muriel actually came to on the day that happened, and we had a little sleepover. It was great. Yeah, and so like all of these things sort of like convened when I started looking for my grandmother, and also like combined with like, you know, graduate study, right? So I'm reading all this theory, and this theory is actually like rearranging the world. It was breaking these like systems of oppression that I took as a given and like teaching me these like ways of seeing that help me understand my position, right? So like hauntology by Derrida, right? Like the idea of like absences in the archive, ghosts in the archive, right? Like racial geographies from Demonic Grounds, Catherine McKittrick, right? Like the idea that like race is mapped, right? And it's mapped around systems of power. Like that helped me understand the border, right? And so I started reading like all this theory, but also I was trying to heal from this like traumatic divorce. My divorce lasted 4 years. It was like awful. We're chill now, it's fine. But it was a really like harrowing time. So like, I don't know how to like describe how much reality broke. PhD is already like reality breaking. It's so hard on your mental health. Divorce, parent of a toddler, like PTSD and ADHD, and then COVID pandemic, lockdown. And then it was like, now you're going to do your exams. And so like my reality very literally broke, and fantasy was the only place where I felt like I had any control in the world. Specifically, like my brother introduced me to video games, and video games, like the choices that you make, the way that you control the narrative, it just was like a place where I found stillness and peace, and I could like center myself. And one of the things that was happening was like I couldn't think about my work because all of that shit was happening, right? But in the video game, because I was centered, I could finally start thinking about my work. But then that fused fantasy and theory. So like I'm like playing Skyrim, I'm fighting the Thalmor, like, you know, the dark snow elves. And I'm trying to bring down fucking Ulfric Stormcloak, you know, the Nord, because I'm just like, fuck the Nords, like, right? I play, so I'm just gonna tell you all this, my Skyrim stuff. I play as a Red Guard. They're the people of color. My brother is a Khajiit. They're the cat people. And we walk around being like, you know, racialized people in this fantasy world. Then I played The Witcher. The Witcher helped me like really heal from my divorce, like in a super real way, in a way that therapy couldn't. But at the same time, I'm like studying for my exams, I'm writing my dissertation, and like, yeah, it just clarified it, right? So when you're writing your creative nonfiction, I think like there's this split that happens because you're trying to like make something beautiful or tell a story beautifully in the ways that you have been taught. But like all the texts of your life are informing it. And that, to me, that's like the key, you know, like that's like the secret sauce, right? It's like, I'm not supposed to be writing about Game of Thrones for my dissertation, but I'm gonna actually, so, yeah.
That was so generous. I don't want to ask more, but I'm curious with that in mind, then what maybe did you come into the program thinking you were going to be maybe writing about? And then
Yeah, I came in wanting to write, so this is my next poetry book that I've been working on 10 years now, Extinct and Endangered Flora of the Americas. It's about the mass sterilization of Mexican women at USC Medical. One of the reasons I was like kind of weird about going to USC is because I knew about this. There was a documentary that came out called No Más Bebés. And I was like, do I want to go to the institution that like sterilized these women? And so I wanted to write about that. But like when you have like 80 traumas happening, right? Like it just makes it really hard to look at that work. So I wrote about, yeah, an elf that wants to end the world. So
Another question.
hi.
I'm Anna. I'm from Brazil.
Hi, Anna.
In the US for like a year and 9 months now. And I'm reading your book, Magical Realism. And so far I view it as a collage, a very hybrid, fragmented collage, but there's heavy social commentary on like cultural products from the white Western.
Mm-hmm.
And like I grew up relating to and loving because of cultural colonization. I grew up relating to and loving cultural products of the white Western.
Yeah.
But I grew up and started to feel embarrassed and like a clown because I shouldn't be relating to or loving this. And when I first came to America and I was talking about punk with someone, they said, wow, you have lots of references from the Western. And I'm like, Brazil is kind of a Western.
Right,
And
yeah.
this was emblematic because it showed how this stuff was not meant for me.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you, how do you deal with this sort of embarrassment and guilt we feel about the way we feel about the white Western projects, you know, in your writing practice,
Mhm.
and writing about them, you know? Is that, do you quarrel with your own affection?
Oh yeah, no, I have an enemy. I have several enemies on on Reddit, Tom Bombadil 46 or something like that.
Let it be known, Vanessa, let it be
Who didn't like my Jon Snow. Yeah. So what is happening to you is that in fantasy, but also in music, right? Like, so you have in fantasy, it's like the lore gatekeeper who's just like, you fundamentally misunderstand Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion. You don't get it. In music, it's the record store keeper that's just like, well, like, do you know Jandek? Do you know, right? So, and this is kind of where I'm going, I think, in my future work, that American history itself is a speculative text, right? Like, it is a fantasy. And the people who are most invested in protecting its lore, like Tom Bombadil 46 on Reddit, like the record store owner, right, are the people who are represented in its lore. And so your engagement, you said punk and sculpture. So your engagement with, punk and sculpture, it's messing with their lore. It's messing with their understanding of the text that they see themselves in. And so they are going to try to police that lore, because any interpretation or any critical reading of their lore, right, it destabilizes their future or the way that they see the world, right? The way I see it is that I am trapped in someone else's story. Like, American history is someone else's story, because I don't have a history. I don't claim American history. Paul Bunyan is not for me, right? Like, Manifest Destiny is not for me, right? And so the way I guess I'm using criticism is a way to start like dismantling that lore that is invested in not imagining me, right? I hope that answered your question. It got like kind of out there, but yeah, but thank you.
Hi, thank you so much, Vanessa. I'm finishing a thesis project about Skyrim poetry, which I'm crazy. I have a degenerative disease that causes blindness and deafness, and I use that game specifically as like a point of catharsis to like inhabit different bodies and landscape, and I think that's what I'm writing about, right? Is the space between fiction and reality. And hearing you speak about your whole talk and your essay was like incredible, and I'm sitting here blown away. And then you're talking about fantasy and escapism, but the reality of the escape, and I feel like I'm gonna cry. Like, it's touching me so deeply, and I just want to know, like, is that something you have written about or will write about? Can I say please?
Yeah. So I put 2 new paragraphs in this essay. Just like today, I was just like, it's missing this. But yeah, it was the one about George R. R. Martin reproducing Santa Fe as the North. And the one about if you are not in the past, you can't be imagined in the future. So that's essentially like I think like the project of my next book. But one of the things that I think I want to explore is once you survive like certain kinds of violence, specifically like intimate partner violence, right? These games can become really safe places to explore intimacy and friendship when you just like fundamentally feel isolated and like you can't connect. So the name of the essay is The Real Housewives of Faerun. So Faerun is the continent that Baldur's Gate 3 is set on, and I'm currently married to Gale of Waterdeep. He's a wizard. And, no, but like these fantasy games have like romances built in them, and I've put an embarrassing amount of hours into those games, not because, I mean, like I do find something new in like Baldur's Gate because it's such a rich game, but it's because like I can't date. And I don't think I will again after my relationship or my marriage ended. And that's okay. Like that's okay. But like I'm interested in how these games and the fandoms that assemble around them, right? They're like queer assemblages, they're feminist assemblages. And I love fan edits. If you find my TikTok, El Norte Recuerda, you'll see that I made a fan edit of Gale and Lucanus de la Morte from Dragon Age the Veilguard, because they're beards, you know, they have beards. And yeah, but like I find actually like such rich engagement that because I'm not in a place where I can experience intimacy, I'm able to experience it in a safe way, right? And so like I think like I'm like thinking through like what the imagination can do when we have these limitations, right? Like whether it's disability, trauma, right? Like yeah, it's just ways of coming back to the world, right? So, yeah.
We have, sorry.
Hi.
I'm Nick.
You are so hype. Like, thank you so much.
Well, I'm hyped because I'm deeply appreciative of
Thank you so much.
witnessing a brown, incredible soul geek out. And much of your work I relate with and dance with. And I just wanted to say thank you. From brown to brown, I'm fourth generation brown of the Cahuenga Valley, but I understand the tension and ambiguity and the violences that you write about, but the way in which you paint, and you're unafraid to paint in ways where you can inject joy, even if it's a glimmer.
Thank you.
And for that, I'm thankful. So I just wanted to share that moment of gratitude with you, from my heart to yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It means a lot to me.
Yeah, so Nick and I, plus Carolyn, two others here, are in a class where we're reading writing manuals, like books about how to write, so that we can write our own non-prescriptive like version of that. And yesterday we were talking about Mary Karr's The Art of Memoir, and in there she has this statement where she just flat out says, like, if you have bad memory, don't write nonfiction.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
And this is in Wendy C. Ortiz's class.
Yes, yeah. So it's, you know, have taken me, you know, we're unpacking that. And I mean, you know, I'm a white person who has really shitty memory and also writes nonfiction. And, you know, because trauma and, you know, and like not having access to like family who would even be able to tell me things and, you know, a million different reasons why, you know, and of course, the people that I'm reading that are writing against that are, of course, like Black, Indigenous people of color who are like, well, their histories, you know, have been erased and like there's so little memory that we can access.
And trans folks too.
Yes. Exactly. It's like, and so I guess my question is, what would you say to like people who are writing nonfiction who have bad memory, vague memory, not a whole lot of memory. And, you know, I know that that's part of the project of this book, which I just started. So I'm sure the answers are in here, but I would love to hear your response to that and the permissions that you gave yourself and what you would say to other writers.
Yeah. So I have a terrible memory. I was talking about an essay I wrote and I had to like pull up the PDF to see what the name of the essay was that I wrote in my book. Like that, it's like that. I was giving a lecture on, you know, basically this stuff, and I couldn't remember the actor who played Paul Atreides, and so I said the pointy elf child, Timothy Chalamet. People knew, they absolutely knew who it was. But in addition to my memory, being affected by trauma and PTSD, anytime I would try to say what my reality was, the people in my life would say, it didn't happen that way, that never happened. So that's why the book starts with that never happened. And that's why the book starts with an essay that looks like footnotes, because like the migrant's journey, right? It's the end is the beginning, right? Or it's like split. The thing is, on top of all that, as a woman of color, first gen, scholar or whatever, I still seem to lack credibility. So if I say something, right, like there's always going to be like some reply guy being like, well, actually, right? So I also have no authority. And so like, how do you even start to tell your stories if you don't remember, aren't believed, people speak over you, and you are not credible, you are not an authority? Those were the 4 sort of positions of where I was just like, why did I sell a nonfiction book? No one is going to believe me, like, right? And so the project of writing, and part of what was so hard was that I would write a sentence and I would doubt myself. I would doubt my own testimony, my own memory. And so what I started to do, and this is, you'll find it like once I tell you. So this is an early draft that Muriel actually saw. I took the page and I split it between magical and realism. And so I would like write either like fantasy criticism or just like a memory I didn't quite know. And then realism was the proof or like the critical, like whatever, right? To like support it if I didn't have it, right? And then my editor was like, love it. We can't do that. We can't print it that way. And so I started doing it in the sentences. And so I would like, make a claim and undercut it, or like make a claim that I couldn't support because memory or credibility or whatever, and then anticipate the critique. And so a lot of the sentences, many of the sentences have like that border in them. This is a claim I'm making. I'm expecting not to be believed. So here is this other thing, right? And so, and that's just kind of like the way I kind of had to force myself to write, because I'm just like, no one's gonna believe me. And then it just happened, right? Like, but so that's the tension of the book, right? Magical realism. I'm making a claim. I don't expect to be believed or taken seriously. So here's my proof, criticism, citation, whatever.
Thinking about how exhausting
Oh, yeah.
that is.
It takes me 4 days to write one paragraph. Yeah. But it's because you want to get it right. Another thing is that like, I almost lost my relationship with my mom a couple of times because I wrote things that she didn't want me to write, like her being undocumented, all this stuff. And you have, like, it's your story, right? Like, we're cool now. I love my mom. She has my dog right now. But like, part of that, like speaking through the silences and refusing silence, right, is knowing that like the stakes are high. And so you have to say, no matter how flawed it is. So, yeah.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
One thing I'm back here. Very appreciative of your writing. And I read parts of the Jon Snow essay to my parents, who were big Game of Thrones fans, and it like blew their minds because they hadn't thought about it that way either.
Are they Jon Snow fans or Daenerys fans?
My mom's a Daenerys fan.
Yeah.
My dad, I don't know, actually. He just really enjoyed the show.
I love Dany, but like also there's some stuff. Yeah.
But that idea of being a fan of something is something that's very important to me, and that I do a lot in my writing and think through like what it means to be a fan of something, why do you care so much?
Yeah.
And have it be a part of your identity. And I love the way that you talk about it throughout the book about, fandoms being a site of collective dreaming and the ways in which we build worlds that way. But also, and this is just my, view of things, but I observe a lot of fandom now as you have pockets of that collectivity, that togetherness, and then the pockets of that hyper individual, the role of the fan is marketable as somebody to, for Marvel to poll and get, how can we get the most money out of these people? And it sort of, you mentioned it like draining, that experience, especially at somewhere like a convention. What, I guess thinking about like trying to imagine worlds or futures outside of what the West has sort of decided is like that individual, that dystopia, that hopelessness. What might be a role of a fan in that process of building a new world, imagining a new future?
I love that question so much. So I have found I've gotten a lot out of fandom and fandom spaces, because I think like after your life falls apart in a way, right? Or like after you've like gone through something and the world no longer feels safe, and imagine the world that you share with others, right? Like it's doing so much. First of all, like critical spaces have disappeared. Like there used to be a time where literary critics were invited on Johnny Carson, and then they would like beef with each other on TV. Who was it? Susan Sontag and some other lady, and they would like fight on David Letterman. Book Forum, Art Forum, one of them disappeared. And I think that like people actually really crave critical interventions in the things that they love, but because criticism is like no longer part of like pop culture, right? I think like that's kind of what fandom is. We're so hungry, and I think we're just like so impoverished for like good stories and good criticism. And I think people actually like really long for high level thinking about the art that they love, right? And fandom is actually where that happens. I don't know if you've ever seen the Game of Thrones theories. Like they're so brilliant, and and I'm just like, this person works in insurance, and they just you know what I mean? And they just made like the most mind-blowing critical intervention, like with like, theorists and like, all of these like texts, right? But that person maybe was born in the wrong zip code, right? Like maybe that person went to a really shitty public school where they told them that like they weren't meant for college, right? And then they never became a critic. And so now on Reddit or TikTok or whatever, they get to just like participate in that. And that's what I see fandom as. Now it can be very toxic. They can do like harassment campaigns and stuff like that. But I also think that like they're radical queer assemblages, borderless collectives, right? That form everywhere. And what I love about K-pop stans is that like fascism will try to fascism, and K-pop stans are like, like Texas put up like a snitch site to report people who, had abortions, right? And K-pop stans mobilized and, flooded it, right? That's incredible. Like that's incredible. And it all happens around a particular piece of art. And so I don't know, I have a lot of respect for fandom. I think it's doing some really amazing things without permission and without credentials. And so I hope I answered your question. Did I answer your question? Okay, good. Okay.
I keep going back to the articles that they were in Harper's Bazaar. It's like a fashion magazine, right?
Yeah.
And here they are publishing these like critical pieces about fantasy, about magical realism, about Planina, the really janky series that came out during the pandemic. Like, how that happen? And do you feel like there are more, less, like where are we at in terms of like spaces for cultural criticism? I really feel like your book and like you now is like a big call, like we need more cultural criticism. Like, but do you feel like, or like, just what is your assessment of like the landscape for publishing cultural criticism?
Yeah, so Harper's Bazaar, Caitlin Greenidge, the novelist, we were mutuals on Twitter, and we just, kind of just talked about the same media and the same stuff. And I remember I was just like talking a lot of shit. I'm a shit poster, or was on Twitter. And I was just like talking a lot of shit about the Selena show. And she sent me a DM and she was just like, first of all, stop giving your ideas away for free. And I was like, oh yeah. I mean, yeah. And then she was just like, do you want to write about the Selena show for Harper's Bazaar? So at first it was just like, here's a new show. It's buzzy, whatever, but I am a shit talker. And so I wrote, the Selena criticism piece. And then from there, I think I just kind of started building the critical stuff. The one that actually surprises me was that the cut essay on The Witcher, that was a cold pitch. I didn't know anyone at The Witcher, and or know anyone at the cut. But my friend Camone Felix published an essay on like abolition there, and was just like, just pitch them. I'll put in a good word. And somehow I got to write about a video game. It was like a long form essay. So sometimes I think it's just like, just try pitching your ideas, and just see what sticks, and I don't know, I'd be happy to like share pitch things. It's kind of just like you're throwing things at the wall just to kind of see what sticks, but like being timely. So like something that like just released, and like having just like a new angle, I think is that's how I pitch. So
a follow-up question to that is, did you write the essays first and then you kind of figured out you were going to collect them and write more into a book, or was there like a different process?
No, the pitch is like, you're like, I have this idea, here's like my, in the email, and like in the subject line, you'll write like time sensitive, or like, no, you'll write pitch in all caps, and then you can put like time sensitive, and it'll be like, Jon Snow is accidentally the best Mexican American, right? And then
I think what I was asking is, like, did you have a book, like magical realism? Was it a book that you were already working on, and then you sort of decided to pitch parts of it to these publications?
Oh, I see what you mean.
Or was it the other way around, where you were writing these pieces and you're like, oh, I think I can make a book?
No, I wrote the pieces first because I was procrastinating on my exams and my dissertation. And then those essays, once they were published, actually became part of my proposal for my nonfiction book. So yeah, like I would actually recommend just like, writing an essay, pitching it, or like pitching it, writing the essay. And then now you have like a publication record. And then when you propose the book, they can see the vision, they can see you've been published here, right? And it was the Witcher essay, which was published, the Selena essay, and the Jon Snow essay, which was unpublished, that I think sold the book. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Maybe we could take one more question, if there's any. Yes.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I haven't had a chance to spend time with the book. I'm excited to. I was curious, like, what was behind choosing to title it magical realism, since you talked about how that's something that people often get boxed into, like the next writers. I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I went through like a little bit of a maladaptive daydreaming, and maybe I'm a witch phase, just trauma. It was just trauma, right? Yeah. And I was like, tarot all the time. And I remember Also, I was like writing my dissertation, studying for exams, and I went to sleep after not sleeping for like a couple of nights. So I was in a state. And I just remember waking up and going, the name of the book is Magical Realism. So the original, this book was going to be 13 essays on all the daughters I couldn't be. It was called Chueca. The word chueca means crooked. And one, I've always had like a really deviated septum. And my dad and I have the same nose, and he calls it la nariz chueca. But it also means like a wayward daughter, like someone who's like messed up beyond, you know. And so that was the name, that was what it was pitched as, or the name on the proposal. And man, I just like could not write those essays. I just was just like, and now they're like little encyclopedia entries in the book. But I just like was really struggling, and I just kept wanting to write about Jon Snow and Dragon Age, and actually that ended up being such a gift, because like one of the main criticisms I get on like Goodreads and stuff is like, oh, I didn't like the memoir pieces. I like the fantasy criticism more. And it's like, yeah, you would actually, because my story doesn't matter, right? These popular texts matter, but my story doesn't matter. And that is actually like kind of, this is going to be a little bit wild, but like, I think like that's kind of like mestizo identity, right? Like that is such a metaphor for like, you know, and so magical realism, the fact that it's like half memoir, half criticism, right? It's about like telling your story with no one's permission and then writing yourself into the imagination, right? So anyway, yeah, it came to me in a dream, which is so annoying. I'm so sorry. from the subconscious, let's say.
I love that you're like literally redefining that word, because that is a completely different definition, and that's so cool.
And yeah, I mean, like magical realism, oh, it's magic intruding on the real world. Well, that's actually trauma. So, right? Like that's what trauma feels like, right? Like your reality breaks, right? So, anyway, yeah, thanks for your question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I love this picture of George. Thank you, Caribbean. Thank you.
Oh my God.
Oh, wait. Wait, I can't. I feel like I'm going to break it again.
Okay, now
So brilliant.
I knew they would.